So let's discuss your New York insurance policy. Uh, in New York, which is a very heavily regulated state, most insurance policies for our basic activities of daily living are generally a regulated form, a form that the Department of Financial Services has to approve. Uh, and that is no different for your automobile policy, right? So your automobile policy contains multiple parts of it, correct? If you actually were to ever open up that policy booklet that you have, right? The first part of the policy booklet is generally going to be a definition section. It's going to have a general section of terms and conditions that apply to various parts of the policy. There's going to be a liability policy, correct? So that's the policy if you're driving a vehicle and you rear end somebody, you hit a pedestrian, you make a left turn and are at fault. That is the portion of the policy that protects you and your family if you get sued. The other portion of the policy would be property damage. That is, again, if you are to rear end somebody, make a left turn, damage somebody else's property, that protects you in the event you get sued. Other portions of the policy involve the uninsured motorist portion. By the way, these are all mandatory portions of the policy. Everything I've discussed right now has to be in the policy. The uninsured motorist policy in New York. I don't know if you know this, but if you're not at fault for the accident and you get rear-ended and someone leaves the scene, right? Your own insurance policy has to pay you up to the mandatory 25,000 for one person or 50,000 for more than one person uh, in damages that you sustained due to the fault of somebody else. That is, your own insurance policy would pay you those damages in that particular instance, correct? That's mandatory. Now, some of the portions of the policy that are, well, the other mandatory portion, which is the no fault portion, and I'll get to that in a second. Uh, Another portion of the policy, which is very important, that really, if you're driving a newer model car, especially given how cars generally keep their value now, it's called the collision portion, right? The collision, as well as the general loss provision, right? So let's say, for instance, you're driving a vehicle and you either rear end somebody or somebody rear ends you, right? You want to get your car fixed. The collision portion of your policy, if you have it, again, it's a not mandatory, it's a optional endorsement, something I recommend you have, but that allows you to go to your body shop, without anyone determining who's at fault at that moment and telling the body shop, I want you to fix my car, right? And they will do that. And then oftentimes what will happen is if someone else at fault for the accident, the two insurance companies, that is the company that paid for the damage to your car and the company that insures the at fault person, they'll generally deal with it themselves through oftentimes intercompany arbitration or through settlement. So in those instances, you don't even know about how it's being adjusted, but you do know that with the exception of paying a $500,000 deductible, oftentimes if you're not at fault, you'll get back anyway. When the claim's adjusted, your car is fixed, right? And within the collision is also the portion of the coverage where, let's say, for instance, through act of God, your car is vandalized or otherwise damaged. Again, same instance, your car is fixed, and you don't worry about, who's at fault for it. Now comes the no fault. No fault portion of the policy is mandatory in the state of New York. The no fault portion is the same like the other policies. It's the same verbiage in every policy. The no fault insurance policy will protect you against any personal injury that you sustain as it relates to medical benefits. It will protect you against loss of earnings up to $2,000 a month. Of course, you can always buy additional personal injury protection, which would increase the amount of coverage you have. In New York, it's $50,000. That's the mandatory no fault that you have to purchase. There are optional coverages where you can buy what's called additional PIP, which is sometimes additional 50 or 100,000 on top of the 50,000. There's a thing called optional basic economic loss, which is again just another $25,000 of optional coverage. So that's, those are things you need to keep in mind. Other optional coverages, some insurance companies cover medical payments coverage. That's generally 5 or 10,000, although Allstate is known for actually writing a $200,000 medical payment coverage endorsement. Uh, medical payment, medical payment endorsement, very rarely triggered in New York, very rarely triggered. For that to occur, you must have been involved in a really tremendous accident because that would require you to essentially blow through all your no faults. Uh, there actually, though, is a weird instance I've seen where if you violate the no fault policy, but the violation doesn't count towards the medical benefits payment portion, you can actually receive payment through the medical payments portion, even though no fault denied you. We used to see that a lot. There was a time years ago, they changed the law about a decade ago, where, and of course, people, years ago just drove drunk more. Not that it was accepted, but it occurred more. And people would get involved in tremendous, tremendous alcohol-based car accidents, end up taken to the hospital, uh, and sustain just tremendous injuries. And the hospital bills are expensive. And the insurance company, they would deny you because there used to be an intoxication exclusion, which doesn't apply to hospital treatment anymore, with some exceptions. But generally, as a result of an accident nowadays, if you're drunk and you hit somebody, you're taken to the hospital. That emergent care up until your point of stabilization is covered by no fault, irrespective of the intoxication exclusion. But years ago, there was an intoxication exclusion that covered everything. What would happen is the hospitals, well, one, they would say, okay, well, you can't prove the intoxication. Putting that aside, the hospitals would grab the medical benefits coverage because the medical payment coverage for the medical benefits didn't have an intoxication exclusion. So it's a nifty little coverage to have. It does cover instances that, no faults will disclaim for. Then the other coverage is supplemental uninsured motorist coverage. And generally, if you're going to have liability limits above the 25,000 minimum, 50,000 aggregate, so you can have generally in New York, you can have with your general insurance policy liability limits. That is, if somebody sues you, how much you're covered for. Generally, it's between 25,000 to 250,000, sometimes 500,000. And again, you would do that if you have property, you have some assets. But here's the flip side of the coin. If you have higher liability limits, you can get higher SUM limits, supplemental uninsured motorist limits. And that's important because most people that are going to injure you in a car accident either don't have insurance or have minimum insurance. So let's say you suffered a really bad injury, you suffered a concussion, you suffered a shoulder or knee injury requiring surgery. The person hit you only had 25,000 in coverage. That's not enough. That's not enough to cover you for the pain and suffering that you're going to endure for, a good portion of your life. So in those instances, I've always recommended, if feasible, get SUM coverage. Of course, to get the SUM coverage, you need to also have higher liability limits. But that's something to always keep in mind because you always got to protect yourself because no one's going to protect you but yourself.